Don't you dare come to my graduation ceremony. If a plain old lady like you shows up, you'll be the laughing stock of everyone. It's my big day, so stay away. My daughter Emily's harsh words made me dizzy. She clearly doesn't think of me as family. To her, I'm an embarrassment. Hey, old lady, where are you right now? As soon as I pressed the call button, Emily's screeching voice pierced my ears. She sounded panicked and anxious. Leaving a silly note like that and thinking you'll get away with it. Where are you? Come home right now. I could also hear my husband Mark's frantic voice in the background. My name is Linda Johnson. I'm a 39-year-old housewife. I've been juggling a part-time office job at a local real estate agency, raising Emily, and doing household chores for over a decade. I married Mark 12 years ago. He had Emily from his previous marriage. I met Mark at the workplace where I worked before we got married. I was working at a construction company, and Mark was there for sales. Our company was tough on contractors, but Mark always came with a smile and a positive attitude, which I admired. I once recommended a product he was selling to my company. As a result, his company got the contract, which led to us going out for meals several times, deepening our relationship, and eventually, he proposed. I happily accepted his proposal and started preparing for marriage, quitting my job in the process. Just before our wedding, Mark confessed that he was living alone with his 6-year-old daughter. At first, I thought it was a lie. It was hard to believe, but it was true. I met Emily a week before the ceremony. She was shy, hiding behind Mark and not coming out in front of me. That's when I decided I would live with her and help her become a respectable adult. I decided to take care of her until she graduated from high school. I don't know why, but I couldn't forget her anxious eyes peeking out from under Mark, so I decided to marry Mark. It was my first marriage, and my family was strongly against it. My father was particularly furious, saying it was nonsensical and that I was being mocked. But I went against my parents' wishes and married Mark. If I had listened to my parents at that time, I might have avoided the trouble that was about to begin. It's been 12 years since that marriage. Emily is now 18 and about to graduate from high school. Normally, it would be a moment of joy, but I couldn't feel happy about it. The thought of making her a respectable adult, which I had when I decided to marry, lingered in my mind. Hey, old lady, where's my t-shirt? Where did you put it? You didn't steal it, did you? Emily began calling me old lady 2 years after we started living together. She used to be kind at first, but then she gradually got used to me and suddenly started treating me rudely. Is this the t-shirt you're looking for? I took it out of the folded laundry and handed it to Emily. Why did you wash it? What if it shrinks? Normally, you should take it to the cleaners. You're so clueless, really so dense. I had hand-washed and air-dried the t-shirt, thinking the fabric would be damaged at the cleaners, but I couldn't say this to Emily. All I could do was apologize. Emily snatched it from my hand, muttering, "You're so useless," before walking away. Her words were sharp and pierced my heart. I couldn't argue back, so I just bowed my head. I couldn't understand why Emily had become so harsh with me. Initially, I thought it was because she was teased about her father's remarriage, but that didn't seem to be the case. Around the same time, Mark's attitude toward me also changed. He used to always be smiling like when he was selling, but lately he stopped smiling at home and became more sullen. He even started calling me, "Hey you." Emily's behavior seemed to follow his lead. I thought maybe I was lacking in some way, so I tried not to cut corners with the housework and watched over Emily carefully. I wanted Emily to grow up to be a respectable adult, but contrary to my hopes, Emily's attitude toward me worsened day by day. Calling me old lady had become the norm for her. I never heard words of gratitude from Emily anymore. What was strange was that at parent-teacher conferences in elementary school, Emily's behavior was normal and she wasn't rude at all. Mark talked normally with Emily, even smiling sometimes. This meant that her terrible behavior was directed only at me, which hurt me even more. Even if I tried to talk to Mark, his attitude was distant, a complete change from before. I had no one to confide in. I continued my life with a heavy, dark weight on my heart. Inside my home, I kept becoming more and more isolated. Since middle school, Emily stopped telling me about school, and Mark would attend school events. I was in a state where I had to learn about the schedule for school events from my neighbors. Mark and Emily seemed to get along well, going out together sometimes. I wanted to be treated as a family by Mark and Emily too. I had always wanted to live happily together. I never imagined it would be this painful to have that wish unfulfilled. And Mark's attitude toward me continued to worsen. Dust is piling up on the stairs. Clean it up. You're a stay-at-home wife, aren't you? The toilet paper is almost out. Are you even cleaning the bathroom? You're really dense, you know. I frequently received such remarks from Mark. When we first got married, Mark and I shared the household chores. Mark had been doing housework while living with Emily, and he was happy at first to share the chores with me. But now I do all the housework. Mark used to say it was wrong for a stay-at-home wife to do all the housework alone. Emily was an easy child to take care of, but this somehow made things worse for me. When I tried talking to Mark about it, he dismissed it as my lack of effort. In the end, everything was my fault, so the more I tried talking to him, the heavier my heart felt. He wouldn't nitpick my housekeeping, constantly criticizing me. You can't even clean properly. No improvement after all these years. Do you lack learning ability? Mark looked down on me with disdain. All I could do was apologize. I'm sorry. I'll try harder. Please forgive me. Mark sighed dramatically as if exasperated. Even if you try hard, you won't be able to do it. That's why you get scolded. Always saying you'll do it, but have you ever? His words kept chipping away at my heart. As time passed, I remained worn out, and Emily turned 18. I was curious about Emily's plans after graduation, but she wouldn't tell me, and neither would Mark. By then, I had stopped talking to Mark and Emily unless absolutely necessary. One day, I overheard Emily and Mark discussing her future after graduation. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I wanted to know, so I listened until the end. I got it. I can go to college on a recommendation, and I even got a scholarship. Thanks to you, Dad. Thank you. I could hear the joy in Emily's voice. She never spoke to me like that. Good for you. It's the result of your efforts. All the housework we dumped on that dense housekeeper was worth it. Were they referring to me as the housekeeper? Yeah, she was a good outlet for stress. I heard their mocking laughter. Quietly, I left the spot and locked myself in the bathroom, the only place I could be alone. I crouched there, holding my head, and cried. To think that Mark and Emily saw me in such a light. I had endured for the past 10 years. No matter how much my heart nearly broke, I continued being Emily's mother and Mark's wife. Even when I felt at my limit and my heart screamed in pain, I forced myself to keep going. There were times I felt I couldn't get up, but I made myself make lunch boxes, prepare breakfast, do laundry, and other housework. Honestly, it hurt to even lie down, but if I did that, I feared I would never again be needed by Mark and Emily. Driven by this fear, I continued to live in exhaustion. Honestly, I don't remember much about this period. One day, after going shopping, a neighbor told me something shocking. Tomorrow was Emily's high school graduation. I couldn't admit I didn't know, so I just smiled vaguely and left. As soon as I got home, I collapsed onto the sofa. I had always thought about making Emily a respectable adult, and her graduation from high school was supposed to be a milestone for that. Again, I was the only one left out in this house. I'm forbidden to have a smartphone or use a computer. The only thing I had is a simple flip phone that can only make calls. Since Mark handles all the school communications, I don't have any mom friends. I had no way to get information about the school. Still, I learned about sports days and recitals from neighbors or overheard children's conversations and secretly attended them. I wanted to properly attend the high school graduation and celebrate Emily's step into adulthood. While I was crying on the sofa, Emily came home from school. Old lady, why are you loafing around? It's so gloomy. You make the whole house dark. Can't you do something about it? Emily glared at me, even though it was her fault. If Emily had told me the date of the graduation, I wouldn't have felt this way. For the first time, I felt anger rising from the depths of my heart. So the graduation is tomorrow. Seems you didn't tell me about it, I asked with a tone of blame in my voice. Emily looked a bit startled by my confrontational words but then sighed dramatically. So what? You're not going to the graduation anyway, so you don't need to know the date. Don't come. If a plain old lady like you comes, you'll just be a laughing stock. It's my big day. Absolutely do not come. I felt dizzy at Emily's words. Clearly, Emily didn't think of me as family to her. I was an embarrassing presence. Just this once, I had hoped for forgiveness, but it was denied. Her words to not come pierced my heart. I was truly just a nuisance, clearly told so by Emily herself. That night, Mark came home with a suit in a dry cleaner bag. He had taken his suit to the cleaners himself without asking me. Of course, he knew about Emily's graduation. When I saw the suit, Mark commented, "Right, you didn't hear about it from Emily." He looked at me with a mix of pity and a smirk. Clearly, I was the least needed in this house. Thinking I was part of the family was just my own delusion. At that moment, I realized my heart had reached its limit long ago, so I decided to end my role as a family member. The next day, Mark and Emily left together for her high school graduation. I was left behind, and Mark even told me not to bother with dinner as they would eat out. I wasn't invited. The old me would have just silently accepted this treatment, but those days were over. I had decided to leave this house. It was a decision I made last night. As soon as they left, I quickly packed my things, left a note, and left the house. I couldn't be part of Mark and Emily's family anymore. I decided to seek refuge at my parents' house, a 2-hour train ride away. There, I would prepare to sever ties with Mark and Emily. The note I left stated my wish to cut familial ties and live independently, and that further details should be discussed through a lawyer. I hadn't found a lawyer yet, but I knew my father could recommend one. My family home is owned by a wealthy family with extensive land holdings. My father, a well-known figure in the area, owns considerable real estate among his contacts. I knew there would be a lawyer available, recalling meeting one during a New Year's greeting at home. Another task I had to undertake was selling the house where Mark and Emily currently lived. This house was built on land owned by my father, funded by him as a wedding gift for me. I had been slowly repaying my father with the money I earned from my real estate job, also introduced by him. Legally, the house, including both the building and the land, was owned by my father. At the time, Mark might have thought the house was a gift and never asked about the ownership problem. He was afraid of offending my father and losing the gift. Mark was the classic home tyrant, bullish with those he perceived as weaker but obsequious to those above him. I told my father everything that had happened. As I spoke, tears flowed uncontrollably, and I had to pause several times due to sobbing. But my father listened to the end, tears in his eyes too. The most relieving part was that my father didn't criticize my initial decision to marry Mark. At the end, my father said, "You've been through a lot." Afterwards, he made several phone calls, and lawyers and real estate managers came to the house. Everything happened quickly from there. It was decided that the house would be demolished, scheduled for a week later. In the note I left, I wrote, "Please leave within a week." My father commented sarcastically, "That's quite kind of you." For me, it was just to avoid any later complaints. During the week, I consulted with the lawyer about the divorce. I also shared the whole story with my mother, and we cried together. I can't forget the fleeting look of fierce determination on my mother's face. I also discussed my future plans with my father. The priority was to establish a new foundation for my life. It took courage to talk to my parents, and it was painful, but once I did, my heart felt lighter. For the first time in 10 years, I slept soundly. A week later, while peacefully staying at my parents' house, I received a call on my cell phone. As expected, it was Emily. Honestly, I didn't want to talk to her, remembering how she had treated me. A black stain spread in my heart. I decided to ignore the call. However, the calls didn't stop, and there were several from Mark as well. They were probably contacting me about the note I left, or maybe the demolition company had contacted them. For 10 years, Mark and Emily continuously called me old lady, exploiting my efforts and treating me like a mere tool. I had endured such inhumane treatment for a long time. The thought of dealing with them again made me shudder, but I couldn't keep running away. To move forward, I needed to settle the past, and without confronting them, I wouldn't feel at peace. After the way they treated me, I felt I owed them a proper response. I steeled myself and answered the phone. "Hey, old lady, where are you right now?" The moment I pressed the call button, Emily's screeching voice pierced my ears. Her tone was hurried and laced with panic. It seemed she was in a state of panic, leaving such a ridiculous note. "You think you'll be forgiven? Where are you now? Come back home right now." I could hear Mark's voice as well. They both seemed to be in a state of panic. I imagined Emily's reaction when she returned from her graduation ceremony to find no old lady to vent her stress on or to serve as a substitute maid. Moreover, there was the note about divorce and leaving the house. Even if it wasn't Emily, anyone would panic, and it happened on the day of her bright graduation ceremony. I couldn't help but let out a faint smile at Emily's frantic state. Who is this, please?" Emily seemed taken aback by my unexpected response and stumbled over her words. I hung up the phone. Afterward, I called the real estate management company to confirm when the demolition would start. It was scheduled for tomorrow as planned, and Mark had already been informed. I requested to postpone the demolition to the day after tomorrow and asked them to inform Mark about the delay. This gave them one more day. Mark would probably come here. That's when I would deliver my final blow to Mark and Emily. I'd ignored the dozens of calls from them. The next day, around noon, I heard the doorbell ring and the sound of knocking on the door. It must be Mark and Emily. They would have wanted to come earlier, but the journey here could be terribly long due to poor connections. Mark and Emily appeared, panting heavily, evidently having rushed here. I had arranged beforehand for my parents to stay back in another room, so it seemed like I was the only one at home. I led Mark and Emily into the living room. Mark entered hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable around my father. My father is a wealthy and well-respected man in town, with a commanding presence. He is, in a sense, a higher authority than Mark. On the other hand, Emily didn't seem intimidated at all. She appeared fully intent on overpowering me and bringing me back home. Emily plopped down on a chair in the living room, crossing her legs and gesturing silently for me to sit opposite her. I took my time preparing tea, moving leisurely, before finally sitting across from her. Emily, growing impatient, addressed me. "What's the meaning of all this?" Mark, sitting next to her, placed the note I had left on the table. I didn't react, just silently meeting Emily's gaze. She averted her eyes first, attempting to dispel the awkwardness with a laugh. "What was that? Who is this act yesterday? Pretty poor performance." I continued to silently stare at Emily. She became visibly uncomfortable under my gaze, shifting in her seat and finally saying, "Look, it's no use. A dumb old lady like you can't survive without us. You're nothing but trash." I almost reacted to her harsh words but restrained myself, noticing the tremble in her voice. Emily was clearly bluffing. Mark had been silent, just watching how things unfolded. "Stop being stubborn and come back home," Emily said, trying to confuse and coax me back with her cruel words. As Emily became more agitated, I responded more calmly. "I don't have a family, do I?" "Oh, I have parents, but you two are not my family, are you?" Emily, clearly out of her element, raised her voice. "What are you saying? Dad and I are your family, right?" "Right, Dad." Emily, feeling at a disadvantage alone, sought support from Mark. Mark looked around nervously, and once he confirmed they were alone, he turned to me with newfound bravado. "That's right. You can't live without us, just like Emily says. So you're coming back." Mark started getting bossy all of a sudden when he noticed my parents were nowhere to be seen. Looking back on it now, what a small-spirited man he is. "Like I said, I have no family," I replied firmly. No matter what Mark and Emily said, I would continue to treat them as strangers. They were not my family. If they were, they wouldn't have treated me like a slave. A true family supports and helps each other, especially when someone is in trouble. But Mark and Emily were different. For 10 years, they treated me like a servant, a vent for their stress. They insisted this was normal, oblivious to how wrong and cruel it was, unconsciously oppressing me. I marvel at how I endured it for so long, almost impressed with myself. This all started when I first saw Emily peeking out from behind Mark's back. I bound myself with the promise to raise her to be a decent adult. I endured and served them for this promise, at least until Emily graduated high school. I had decided that Emily's high school graduation and her moving on would mark the end of our relationship. I had held a faint hope that if Mark and Emily changed their ways and improved their attitudes towards me by the time of her graduation, I would continue walking with them as a family. But they betrayed my expectations, leading to this situation. Everything was decided the day before the graduation ceremony, so now I confront them with the appropriate attitude. Mark and Emily are no longer my family, therefore, I will not treat them as such. Realizing the significance of my treating Mark and Emily as strangers, Emily altered her approach. "We're family, aren't we, Mom? Stop this silly act, please." She suddenly switched from calling me old lady to Mom. Realizing her usual tactics wouldn't work, Mark swallowed hard, watching Emily and me intently. "Even though you're not my birth mother, we've lived together all this time, so please listen to my request." Her previously defiant posture had changed to one more pleading. "I have no obligation to respond to requests from someone who isn't family," I replied, maintaining my composure and emotional distance. Tears appeared in Emily's eyes, and she looked at me desperately. "Please, listen to me. The note you left, it's not true, right? Emily's use of the term mom made my skin crawl, especially since her main concern seemed to be the house. She was anxious about losing it, and while it was true that the house was going to be demolished, her priorities seemed misplaced. In the end, it appeared that as long as she had a place to live, it didn't matter whether I was there or not. No matter how much Emily pleaded, my feelings remained unchanged. She lowered her face, apparently crying. "This is some kind of joke, right? You can't be serious with this attitude," Mark said, seemingly upset by Emily's tears, and then turned his anger towards me. "What's with that note? Come back right now and stop the demolition." "I can't do that. The decision has been made," I continued in a restrained voice. "Please understand, I've already told you we're not family." Neither Mark nor Emily seemed willing to listen. "Do you think you can get away with doing this to your family?" Mark exclaimed. "That's why I've been saying repeatedly that they are not my family," I replied, wondering how many times I had to repeat the same thing. Suddenly, Mark stood up and slammed his fist on the table. "Don't joke with me," he shouted. I was startled but managed not to react. "After not treating me as family for 10 years, you can't suddenly expect me to behave like one. It's impossible." I ended up raising my voice more harshly than I thought. "I'm angry too. I don't show it in my attitude, but anger is bubbling up from deep inside me, about to erupt like magma." Mark and Emily's selfish actions were unforgivable. They trampled on my 10 years of suffering and my efforts to overcome it. I had tried to build a family with them, but they rejected it, mocking and using me all this time. The loneliness and pain of being left out were overwhelming. Mark and Emily wouldn't understand. I had wished so many times to be treated like family, but my wish never came true. It took me 10 years to give up, despite my continuous efforts to build a relationship as a family, as Emily's mother. This was the outcome. A self-mocking smile appeared on my face. Seeing my dry smile, Mark and Emily stared at me in shock. Mark seemed to lose his strength, slumping into the chair. These two, far from understanding my feelings, tried to use me until the very end. I thought bitterly. No matter how much I cared for Mark and Emily, they never cared for me. Even though I cherished them, they never cherished me. And then, when they found themselves in trouble, they said things like, "We're family," that they never meant, just to use me. It's just too convenient. Terms and with her own decision, Mark. "This is not a misdeed on her part," my father stated firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mark seemed taken aback, his confidence visibly shaken. Emily, who had been quiet, spoke up nervously. "Mom, please reconsider. We can still be a family." I looked at Emily with a mixture of sadness and resolution. "Emily, you and Mark have made your choices clear over these years. I appreciate your apologies now, but they come too late. This divorce paper is not negotiable." Mark's attempt to regain control failed as my parents' presence underscored the seriousness of the situation. They were witnesses to my resolve and the support I had in making this decision. My father's sharp gaze conveyed disapproval, and my mother's stern expression emphasized their stance. Mark's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, seemingly unable to comprehend the finality of the situation. He glanced nervously between me and my parents, then slowly nodded, defeated. "I understand," Mark finally said, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. "I'll sign the divorce papers." I handed him a pen and the divorce papers. He hesitated for a moment, then scribbled his signature on the document. There was a heavy silence in the room as he handed the papers back to me. Emily, tears streaming down her face, looked at me pleadingly. "Mom, please." "I'm sorry, Emily," I said softly but firmly. "This is how it has to be." My parents stood quietly behind me, their presence a silent reassurance. Mark and Emily exchanged a glance, both realizing the weight of my decision. With a sigh, Emily nodded slightly, her tears falling freely now. "I'll respect your decision, Linda," Emily said in a subdued voice. I nodded, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. "Thank you, Emily." Mark stood up abruptly, his face a mask of defeat. "I'll leave now." As Mark and Emily left, my parents walked up to me, embracing me wordlessly. It was a moment of closure, the end of a painful chapter in my life. I knew there were challenges ahead, but for the first time in years I felt a sense of freedom and self-respect. "Let's go home," my father said gently. "Yes, let's go home," my mother echoed, leading the way out of the room. As we left the house together, I knew I was finally on the path to reclaiming my life, free from the toxic bonds that had held me back for so long. I was trying to convince her to come back. Emily was being persuaded by Mark to agree with him. Linda's wrongdoing was being discussed. My father's loud voice filled the house, making the windows rattle. Mark and Emily were shocked and held their breath. My father stood in front of Mark, looking down at him. He questioned Mark's view of Linda's actions as selfish, saying he only cared about himself. Then my father turned to Emily. He accused her of causing trouble at school. He had found out through his connections that Emily was taking money from another girl at school who was too scared to tell anyone. Emily denied it, but my father had proof. He also found out that Mark had been stealing money from his company by faking business trips. My father had hired a detective agency to investigate, originally for his divorce case, but they uncovered these shocking truths about Mark and Emily. My mother decided it was enough. She told them to sign the divorce papers and leave immediately. Mark reluctantly signed, realizing they had missed the last train out of town. They ended up in a small hotel and faced consequences. Mark lost his job, and Emily was expelled from school. Back at home, I decided to start fresh, leaving my part-time job and moving to a peaceful resort area with my dog.